This presentation will examine the question of the relationship between environmental issues and property economics, especially in terms of impacts on valuation and other aspects of property economic practice. The first thing to consider is the fact that property rights include implicit obligations attached to property. While this is not so much a conscious matter to modern property owners, it is something that different cultures, and in fact in different periods of time, has been understood to be a vital part of that package of rights and obligations which is associated with the ownership of property. What this means is that while I might own real estate as freehold, there is still an overarching expectation that that ownership does not enable me to use that property in a way which is in some way antisocial. For this reason, we have various planning constraints which are considered appropriate, because even though they constrain my free use of my own property, they do realize a higher good, and that is the common good objective of having a more orderly and attractive built environment. The environmental concern is a second dimension of possible obligations associated with property. And what they would suggest is that a property owner is obligated to the community to use their property rights, their property wealth, in such a way as to provide the best overall situation for not only themselves but also the community in general, and especially for the community into the future. A second dimension of the environmental importance on property is that a healthy environment is connected with a flourishing economy into the future. By this is meant that if we deplete our environment today, it will mean that future generations will have a limited economic opportunity compared to the present. If we understand that future generations have the same rights to a flourishing economy as we do, then it means that we must accept any reasonable self-restraint with respect to the use of our property, so as to mean that there will be equal opportunities available for the future. The good news is that if environmental management or stewardship is associated with a flourishing economy into the future, a flourishing economy is also associated with flourishing property values. And this would suggest that if we're able to guarantee a situation where society and the economy is able to flourish into the future, this should mean that our property values should experience increasing growth into the future. And so this would suggest that environmental self-restraint should be associated with superior property outcomes. Another connection between real estate and the environment is that real estate itself is a part of the environment, both in terms of the land element from which we might take raw materials, but also in terms of the built component, which uses raw materials and various types of manufactured components in such a way that can either help or hinder the general environment. While these things suggest that we need to be sensitive to environmental issues, it's also important to be aware that false fears can be rather costly. And by this we can consider that if we are unnecessarily cautious with our environmental management, this can include things like unnecessary building costs and also unnecessary running costs. For instance, if it became apparent, or at least if it became a concern, that, let's say, PVC was an environmental hazard, even though it's used in many things in the built environment, such as drain pipes, sewerage pipes, guttering, electrical conduits, and many other features within building, cover strips and so on. What we could do is eliminate the PVC and replace it with other materials, such as been used in the past, especially metals such as galvanized iron and so on. However, the replacement of PVC with galvanized iron introduces two lines of problems. One is galvanized iron is more expensive, it's more expensive to work, it has a shorter life expectancy, and itself may introduce its own set of environmental problems, due especially to the problems associated with zinc in the environment, or at least the potential problems of zinc in the environment. The point here is that if we ban PVC from the built environment prematurely due to some fear about this particular material, it means that building costs will go up. That would be reasonable if PVC is in fact a reasonable hazard, or is a significant hazard. As it is, there have been calls at different times to ban PVC on the basis of its chlorine content, because over time it releases a very tiny amount of chlorine into the atmosphere, and chlorine has been associated with the depletion of the ozone layer. However, the actual quantity of chlorine that PVC releases is absolutely microscopic, and this would suggest that the fear of its use in the built environment is in fact unfounded. Therefore, the costs involved in its replacement with other things are quite unfounded. Similarly, false fears can increase running costs, say by unnecessary treatment of the various inputs which go into a building, such as, for instance, the treatment of wastes such as wastewater and so on. A third problem which can come from unfounded environmental fears are unnecessary economic problems generally in society, which have contingent impacts on property values through property rents. Overall, it's important that if an environmental issue is going to be taken so seriously as to result in policy that will cause the economy generally to be depressed, we would have to be very certain that the environmental problem is unambiguously certain. An example of this was the call by some to shut down all of Australia's coal-fired electricity generators. While this could possibly have environmental benefits, the benefits don't seem to square with the environmental costs when they are soberly evaluated. However, the potential for shutting down most of our electrical generation capacity would be so great as to cause a major general economic depression, which perhaps Australia and other countries that took this form of policy seriously would take a long time to recover from. And this leads to consideration of what's known as the precautionary principle. This is the principle that states that where the environmental impacts of a particular line of practice are uncertain, or at least unknown, then it's precautionary, prudent, to manage situations in such a way as to not risk the possibility of these problems, these bad impacts happening, even though the actual connection between the practice and the bad impact is poorly understood. The precautionary principle is a strange creature because in itself it is not scientific. It rests on a particularly non-scientific premise, and that is how to deal with things which are not scientifically understood, and in fact concerns which are not scientific. And the management of those concerns can involve responses which are anything but value neutral for the current community. going back to the example of shutting down the coal-fired power stations, we can see that if we were to do this on the basis that just perhaps coal-fired power stations did cause some unknown environmental problem, and the important issue there is unknown, then the cost to the community would be absolutely immense. What we can see is the precautionary principle is reasonable in cases where the costs of taking the precaution are not excessive. However, the balance between the real costs, soberly considered, and the real threat, again soberly considered, especially when you only use the precautionary principle in cases where you don't know what the real relationship is, make the application of this principle highly problematic. At this point, it's useful to look a little bit more closely at the types of environmental questions that can be considered. The first general group of environmental issues are related to problems that have been the result of the human society, but whose solutions is also a matter of human society technical or scientific response. And this can be summarized in the observation that humanity has invented garbage, but it has also invented the garbage bin. And what this means is that where our behavior has caused a problem, we need to develop the scientific and technical responses to be able to deal with the problem. In other words, management successfully. We find this management approach has been used successfully in connection with a number of issues, such as the matter of industrial emissions, the stuff that comes out of chimneys in factories. Also for packaging issues. The matter of contaminated land is an important environmental management issue that's important to property economists. And one of the interesting things about the problem of contaminated land is that while it began some decades ago as a major problem, advances in the treatment of contaminated land have resulted in the cost of decontamination becoming quite manageable. Another issue is the question of the extent and management of forestry resources, also water supply and exhaust emissions from motor cars. That back about 40 years ago or so constituted one of the major pollution sources in most cities. However, now it has been tamed through the development of low emission vehicles and so on. These management issues can be contrasted to what we could describe as global environmental issues. And rather than looking at the technicalities of human society and the technology of its operation, we look at more global issues that can be summarized as resulting from the problem that humans, in one way or another, are destroying the planet. And as a result, society as it is going at present is unsustainable. The solution here is to eliminate the causes, and if humans are the cause, the call for reversing technology and maybe limiting the human quality of life are amongst the toolkit for dealing with global problems. And we can see that the global problems have the potential to have far greater impact on the life and life expectations of people all over the planet. The issues that are normally treated at this level are things like species extinction, ozone depletion, global warming, overpopulation, food and resource shortages, and also the overall question of global population levels. We can contrast the management type of environmental issues, which can be dealt with technical, economic and scientific solutions, as things that we can be relatively optimistic about. We have been able to clear the air over most major cities. We have been able to eliminate many of the problems associated with packaging and water supply. However, the global issues are a little bit more pessimistic, and they tend to be treated more at a political level in terms of major policy issues rather than straight out technology. We find that while there is a certain amount of overlap between management issues and global issues, this distinction is still fairly important in terms of the overall perspective of how we view solutions to these problems. While there are a very large number of current environmental issues, it's instructive to look briefly at the progression of environmental awareness over the recent centuries. In the early 1930s, there was considerable concern, especially coming out of England, about coal consumption, especially British coal consumption, where graphs of increases and patterns in coal consumption extrapolated into the future suggested that British coal consumption alone would deplete the world's resources of coal by the end of the century. And in the 1830s, that meant the year 1900. Clearly, the year 1900 passed with still some coal left in the ground. By the time we get to the year 1970, or around that period, we find that there was a new spate of environmental issues and a coming of age of environmentalism as a major social and political issue. Around 1970, the first major global climate concern emerged, and this was concerns that, looking at the patterns of global temperatures, it was very likely that we were slipping into a coming ice age, that is, global temperatures plummeting to impossibly cold levels for the support of human society as we know it. Around that time, there was the first great oil concern, and estimates of oil reserves in the early 70s suggested that, at least by the estimates of the time, oil was going to run out, in other words, totally be lost to the planet, by about the year 1980. Likewise, coal reserves were expected to expire by the year 2000. Around the early 70s, the coming ice age was relatively rapidly changed in concern for global warming, which is curious considering it's a global temperature concern but running in exactly the opposite direction. At that time, it was estimated that the sea level would rise somewhere between 0.6 to 1.6 meters by the year 2000. Obviously, that would be a fairly serious problem. As it turned out, by the year 2000, there still was oil in the ground. There was still coal adequate, and in fact the estimates of coal resources around the year 2000 were something like 3 centuries of use of available coal, both in terms of current use levels and the current rate of growth. And as far as sea level rise, there was negligible sea level rise between 1980 and 2000, a matter of something like about 20 millimeters. Likewise, in the late 1960s, Paul Ehrlich published his first edition of The Population Bomb, where he argued that by the 1980s there would be widespread starvation in the world, erupting into food wars and overall major problems in the supply of adequate food for the people of the planet. At that time, there was also concerns for widespread deforestation and the early enunciation of what has become known as the problem of species extinction, where it was estimated that at least tens of thousands of species would be extinct by the year 2000. When we look at the environmental issues that were raised in the 1970s, we also find some that were in fact quite well founded, such as the pollution levels in major cities, especially in London, where the use of open coal fires in houses had resulted in very serious air pollution problems. problems such as these had been largely overcome. But when we look back on these issues, we find that problems like the urban air quality problem have been overcome largely. Many of the others have been found to be quite unfounded, and a few have remained in the popular arena as issues that we are still concerned about and still doing a lot of scientific research into to see how significant they are and what is the appropriate response. The most important of these at present is the question of anthropogenic global warming. This refers to the problem with the Earth's climate warming as a result of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide produced by humans, and hence the anthropogenic part of the global warming title, or AGW problem.